Today we're talking about Business Works, evaluating the top 150 business books of the past decade. I ranked the top 150 business books by looking at the New York Times business bestseller list. The New York Times, if you're not familiar with this, puts out a monthly list of the best business books. Over a course of 10 years, there are 10 years times 12 months times 10 spots. There's potentially 1,200 books on that list. This list should not be confused with the non-fiction bestseller list, which is released weekly. Of those 1,200 potential spots, there were 285 unique titles, which means the rest of the spots were taken up by books being ranked multiple times. To further reduce this list, I then just took the books that had been ranked 2 or more times, and that got the list down to 151. Then we dropped one that clearly wasn't about business, and we got to a nice round number of 150 business books of the last decade. Before we get into revealing the list, I just want to go through a few points that I think were interesting in the methodology and the books that did get ranked. One of the things that became very clear is that these books have been ranked on this exponential curve, which is incredibly steep. The top book, Thinking Fast and Slow, was ranked 96 times out of a possible 120. So it basically has been on there for 9 years straight. The last 69 books were ranked only twice. And for me, this is important to call out because if you look at number 20 being ranked 10 times, you can look at 130 books here that are very, very statistically similar. And in fact, the last 100 were only ranked 3 times or less. If you look at that and we put it back on the original chart, we see of the 1,200 potential spots, 473 have been taken up by the top 10 and 93 of those spots by the top 1 book. That's interesting to me because even within the top 150 business books, books that have already made the Times list, there's still this exponential curve of attention, which brings the question, why even use this data if it's kind of that skewed? Is the best book really 93 times better than the rest of the books at the tail end of the list? And it's a hard question to solve because what we're really looking for is this blue circle. What's insightful? And that can be really hard to quantify. It's really hard to gauge insight and impact of a book. The next thing we can look at is what people buy and what the media rate. We hope that those two circles are very, very closely aligned. We know they're not 100% aligned because the New York Times puts books on there however it likes, and it doesn't disclose its numbers and it doesn't disclose its methodology. We know there is some bias in it, and what we're hoping is there's not much bias. But even if there is, I think that the books on this list paint an interesting picture of what gets our attention. The New York Times strongly sets the books that we talk about, and the New York Times best-selling authors have a platform. Worst case scenario here, these are the books that we've all been talking about quite a lot for the last 10 years. This is what the agenda has been. Let's get into the list here. This is the list of the best business books of the past decade, ranked 1 to 150 by the number of times they've appeared on the Times business list. One of the checkpoints I did when I first saw this list is how many of these books had I read previously. And it was interesting because I had read 1/2 of the top 20 and then 4 or 5 of the rest. So at least for me, the agenda setting that we'd spoken about in the previous slide seems to track. And that's a sample of one. And I get that I may be an outlier, usually am. But if you look through this list, a lot of these books you've heard of, you've seen, they've been spoken about. Another thing to point out on this list is some of them could have been written previous to 2013, but as long as they were ranked in January 2013, they still made the list. And then in terms of tiebreakers, I've ranked them first by the number of times they are on the New York Times business bestseller list. And then tiebreakers, I have just ordered alphabetically. What would have been great here if we could have had sales data, number of copies sold. That number is notoriously hard to get hold of. You can get a free summary of each book on this list on my website at jamesgreaves.me/bestbooks. I've gone through and I've called out the main learning points and an overview and links. And you can see the information behind the analysis that I've done in a 375-page PDF. If you're interested in any of the books on this list, well worth taking a look at that and having a flick through it. If nothing else, it's probably something good to have. If an idea comes up and you need to very quickly understand, you know where to look. One of the first things I noticed as I started going through this list of books is how broad the definition of business book is. As I read each one, I just classified it according to what I thought it was about. And this isn't what the publisher had said or what the media was saying. These are all categories that I've created. When I got done with that, I found there were 15 different categories. And it was surprising to me how broad those categories are and how different. And we've got books in here that I would question if they should be on a business list. For example, there's a book on here about how to optimize your Social Security benefits. There's a book on here about how to avoid a climate disaster by Bill Gates. There is a book on here about about how to deal with China. There is a book about AI and the future of technology. There's books about startup. There's books about psychology, about how your brain works. And there's three big categories here that are really just different types of case studies. Biography being about the people, investigation being by reporters looking into generally bad things that happened, like the Theranos scandal and the 2008 credit crisis. And then case studies, which are very similar to biographies. There's a small line between those, but generally I've put case studies in where it's mostly about the business. There's a book in there about the everything store, which is Jeff Bezos and the Amazon story, but because it trended more towards Amazon, it's a case study, whereas Shoe Dog, which is about Phil Knight, and Nike is much more about Phil Knight than it is Nike, so that's a biography. I also used AI to mine for insight to classify some of the works, to search them for key phrases, search them for ideas, and to map them together. I've done a dozen of these. I've cut the data lots of different ways, and I think there's lots more ways that I can cut this data. In this presentation, I'm going to show you one way through based on some of the most interesting trends that I have seen in my first couple of weeks of really just crunching this data and playing with it. The first one, and I think that the most interesting view to me, has been if I map the books by personal versus societal focus and soft skills versus hard skills. When we sort them by focus, we look at individual focus. So that could be focused on every single individual on the planet. Thinking Fast and Slow by Kahneman is an example of a book that would be in the individual area. It applies to everyone, but it applies to everyone individually. In the company segment, these dark blue, leadership and management, a book like Blue Ocean Strategy is actually the only strategy book on the list. It has been put into the management section because there were only 4 management books, so strategy and management, and they're about companies. How do you run a company? How do you deal with a company? And then the macro trends about how does the economy work, Chinese relations, the history of business, falls into these orange ones at the bottom: future, politics, history, and economics. These light blue ones I've also called out with stars here: biography, case study, and investigation, as I spoke about on the previous slide, transcend all of these and really kind of arbitrarily. So if you have a book about the everything store with Bezos and Amazon, there's some principles in there. There's some individual application. There's some company application. There's some macro trend. And the other one I would call out is startup. I had originally had startup and company because there are 6 startup books, and I had them under company because it was how to build a company. But when I looked deeper into them, I found out that 5 of them were really about get your mindset right and build your own social brand, and then think about what idea you want to do. And it's very much around how do you be an individual entrepreneur or a solopreneur or start your own company than the principles of managing a company. One book fell out of that came back into the leadership bucket and management bucket from the startup section, which is 0 to 1 by Peter Thiel, which is the only really startup book that was about how do you run a company and how do you think as a company, kind of company systems. I've also tried to rank them here by art versus science. So are they soft skills or hard skills? Personal finance being something that you could definitely write a how-to. It's 1, 2, 3, it's math. Balance your budget, set goals, invest in a Roth IRA. On the other side, inspiration. You're great, you can do it, believe in yourself. Very much more an art. And then everything in between. When you take these levels of focus, individual, company, and macro, and count how many fit into each, the results are not even. And with 150 books, you might expect them to even out in some way. And by far, the biggest category is individual. A lot of books on you can do it, or you can be better, or this is how you think differently, this is how you invest your money, this is why you should be a generalist, this is why you should keep checklists, this is why you should focus on other people. Tons of books about the individual, and really only 11 about company. Most of those are about leadership. Leadership books being by definition about company, because you can't lead on your own. And then there's really only 3 that are about management, which was surprising. If you'd have asked me this number before I had done this research, I would have guessed it would have been 20%. Also, the ranking loves this bottom category of case studies, investigations, and biographies. We have tons of those. Lots of famous people, financiers, celebrities, tech rappers, authors, all of them explaining how they built their business empire and how you can do it too with a little bit of grit and determination and a lot of belief in yourself and overcome your trials, and you will do it too. People there from Edison to Elon Musk to Ben Bernanke. So how do we focus on core business books? And I wanted to further dive into books that I thought were actually really, really core business. Going back to this grid from before and really trying to zoom in on that top left segment. So we can leave out the science ones. Personal finance drops out because it's not particularly a subjective field. The case studies, investigations, politics, and history I think are interesting, but it's a different type of investigation. I also excluded biography and startup from this list, even though they technically fit inside the box. box. The 74 books left in this box should in theory be the books that can tell us how to do better in our careers, better as leaders, better in companies, better at running your own businesses. These are the books that kind of get into like, these are the principles you should be aware of. So I wanted to see what principles those were investigating. And this is what I found when I started mapping them together. So if I try to boil down what these books are about within another subcategory, we get this diagram here. I don't know a ton to say about this page other than to leave you to sit with it. And I think there's a lot more we can research in this. Let me take you on one of the possible journeys. The lack of management books in this list is striking to me. If we go back on that past list, there are so many books out of this 150 that are, you can do it, believe in yourself, let's work together, work out how your brain works, you're better than you think you are. There's a lot of rah-rah. And maybe that's just my Englishness coming out because, us English don't do a lot of that. And this is an American list after all. But I look at how few management books are. There are only 3 what I would call management books. And I'm using management and leadership here more broadly than I did on the last slide. What I'm saying here by leadership is how people move people. This idea that you can be a leader from anywhere. You can be a leader wherever you're standing, wherever you are in the organization. You don't need permission to be a leader. You are a leader if you can affect other people. So getting other people to do things, to believe things, to follow you, follow a cause, to work together. You're a leader if you show the way. And most of the books on the previous slide are about you can lead, understand yourself, lead yourself, be unique. And we have very few books on how to work within a company. And the definition of management for me is how companies move people. This is much more around formal authority. Company leaders have fiduciary responsibility. It's a legal role, and they cascade that through organizations and cascade requirements for jobs. They cascade work that needs to be done, and they manage according to that work that needs to be done. So management is the needs of the organization, and leadership is the needs of the individuals. And we have very much gone on to leadership, which I think is great, by the way. I'm not dissing leadership. I think it's massively powerful and useful, and we should do more of it, and everybody needs to be better at it. But not if we don't have management already in the mix. Because if you don't already have a baseline of management and everybody working together on a structured, consistent way to solve a common goal, the leadership piece put on top of it, which is you can all be exceptional and let's unlock our own potential and let's be vulnerable and let's be tenacious, all these wonderful things that are spot on, they kind of fall short if there isn't a solid bedrock. I wanted to find out what the most influential book of the 90s. And I had this one list that I found online that came up with these 8 books. And they're ranked similar to the way I had done my study, which is 2 of the most important books of the 90s, even though they were written in the 80s. And I wanted to look at those against the best books of the past 10 years, which you also see on this list here. And you don't have to have read all these books to see that the 90s books are all about working within companies. They're all about corporate effectiveness. The second group of books are all about how the brain works and being exceptional. And I think they're both great lists. And I think everyone should probably read all of these books. The question then is, though, why don't we talk about management as much as we used to? Is it because we've already done it? We've already solved it? These books already tell us everything we need to know about management. And if that's true, then we have no problems with management because we've already cracked it. And I don't think that's true. The next thing could be that maybe it's just not attractive. If you're going to be an author right now, what are you going to write about? It's like, this is how you succeed in a corporation in a time where everybody's trying not to work for corporations anymore. The reality is hundreds of millions of people globally still work in corporations. So we can pretend that everyone's going to become this solopreneur and start their own business. Everyone's going to become a YouTube or a TikTok influencer, and we don't need to know how to do this stuff anymore. But the reality is we absolutely do need to know this stuff. What's happening right now is over the last 30 to 60 days, all the major tech companies have been letting about 10% of their workforce go. This is significant because as recently as February and March, we were still talking about the Great Resignation, and employees could go anywhere they wanted, and companies better look out because employees have all the power and they're going to go do stuff, and you can't keep them, and good job finding employees. Within the same year, the same companies are laying off a significant portion of their workforce. We can see this fight between talent and companies as to who has the power. This also drives management versus leadership ideologies. Right now on the way up, if you've got this long sustained growth period, taking kind of COVID out of the mix there of that one dip, but you've got this nice long sustained growth. And of course in that sustained growth, we are continue to talk about improving talent and training talent. And then on the way down, if we have a period of strong retraction, we end up talking a lot more about efficiency, strong management principles like what did you get done, and the reversal of the power now being in the company's hand to get more out of their employees. Whereas before, taken at the worst, companies could just be lucky that their employees are there at all, right? It's like, well, of course, if I'm only working 50% 50%, well, you're just lucky to have me because I'm so great, right? And you get this amazing sense of entitlement. And by the way, that is what we are seeing. And I just pulled a couple of headlines here, but we could pull more. Google's CEO said he has real concerns over productivity as he started laying off people, but also goes on to talk about how the workforce aren't as efficient and focused as they could be. Now, this is a management problem. Just a few days ago, the founder of Oculus resigned from Meta and blasted them on the way out. And I just love this quote, and I'm bringing it up because it just happened as I was putting this together. He says, "There is no way to sugarcoat this. I think our organization is operating at half the effectiveness that would make me happy. Some may scoff and contend we are doing just fine, but others will laugh and say, half, I'm at a quarter efficiency." And he laments how Meta has spent $10 billion on VR and that he, one of the top positions within that company, has no ability to get anybody to work any faster and to be effective and put things together and focus. And that Meta's just lucky that employees are there working for Meta because they're so special. You can tell if your organization is out of balance by looking at a few key pieces. And we've all seen companies that have too much management and too little leadership. And they can stifle innovation, it creates silo thinking, and you grow political fiefdoms, and it can lead to poor employee well-being. And corporate excess is not checked, which basically means what we had in the 90s, where these corporations were kind of doing what they want, and there weren't enough whistleblowers and people inside that said, hold on, let's not do that. On the other hand, if you get too much leadership, which is where I think we are right now, we have lack of efficiency, confused and unclear priorities, focused on short term over long term. And it can be impossible to change things internally. Controversial change is also impossible. And I spoke about this principle a lot in my last analysis on Freebird, talking about Elon Musk's takeover of Twitter and how a lot of the employees there felt a huge sense of entitlement and that they could fight the owner. Now, whether or not you should fight him, I don't know. But the point is, you have a lot of employees who think that they can, and they can't. It doesn't work that way. That's not how management works. And so that's a case of too much leadership, should we say, quote unquote leadership inside Twitter, and poor performance not managed. So you get a lot of people basically not doing a lot of stuff, and the ones that aren't all focused on the right things. This is the direction I took the research because I'm passionate about how we balance the need of individuals and organizations, how we balance both management and leadership. And I saw a massive mismatch as the first thing I saw as I went through this data set. I'm sure there's lots of very interesting things we can investigate further. If there's anything else you'd like to investigate this, let me know. And if you haven't downloaded the book, remember you can get summaries of every single book at jamesgreaves.me/bestbooks.